Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in this video we are going to continue with our Cursed Founding Chapters series by going into the Blood Gorgons chapter. The Blood Gorgons are an obscure chapter of Renegade Space Marines said to have been the product of the notorious Cursed Founding, and in this video we're going to dive into what lore they have available to them in order to speculate whether or not they were actually the results of the Homo sapiens Novus project on Inculaba. The Blood Gorgons chapter were once a loyalist chapter of Adeptus Astartes who eventually became a renegade chapter. The Blood Gorgons color scheme is black and deep red. Their heraldry is officially unrecorded, scrubbed from the records of the Imperium, but it was described as the head of a Gorgon creature, similar to that mentioned in ancient Terran mythology. Their gene seed lineage is also unknown, but after going over their available lore, we will attempt to figure out possible lineages. There is so little information on this chapter. It's common for that to be the case with Renegade Space Marines that much of their information is expunged from the Imperial records. Still, we're going to try and decipher what we can and fill in parts of the lore that are missing with theories and speculations like we always do. The Blood Gorgons chapter was created sometime in the late 35th to early 36th millennium, and it's believed to have been created as part of the Cursed Founding, or what was called the Homo sapiens Novus project. However, as we know, sometimes a chapter is said to be a part of a founding that existed around the same time that they were created, even though that doesn't mean there was a correspondence. Specifically, with chapters said to have been created during the Cursed Founding, they could have been created during the Dark Founding, which happened around the same time. Though at this point in our video it would be preliminary assumption, it is possible that the Blood Gorgons were not a result of the Cursed Founding and were instead products of the Dark Founding. For every one of the Cursed Founding chapters, the available information goes over what the Cursed Founding was and why the chapters are considered cursed. Each explanation is subtly unique. With the Blood Gorgons entries, it says that the Cursed Founding Astartes were created to better combat the forces of chaos that arose during the heresy, by lacking the flaws and mutations that chapters had previous to the project. Now, this was never explicitly stated in the official lore for the Cursed Founding, that the goal was to fight the traitor legions. As far as we know, the goal of the Cursed Founding was to get rid of gene seed flaws. Another discrepancy in the lore for this chapter is that it says that the Cursed Founding was one of the largest foundings to happen since the Second Founding. Only 7 chapters were said to have been created as part of the Cursed Founding. However, an unknown number of chapters were created during the Dark Founding. Though records say that the Blood Gorgons were stationed in the Bastion sector, it's officially unknown where the Bastion sector is on Imperial maps, due solely to the connection of that extra information on the Cursed Founding, which stated that the Marines made during it were made to fight the traitors of the heresy. I would theorize that the Bastion sector was near the Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror is a maelstrom where real space is opened to the warp. At the end of the Horus Heresy, most of the traitor legions fled into the realm of chaos that is the Eye of Terror, and it's from this warp opening that the chaos forces emerge to launch attacks upon the Imperium. The area around the Eye of Terror is just as dangerous as being inside of it. Warp energy radiates outward from it light years away, affecting the population of hundreds of thousands of worlds with madness, chaos, corruption, and destruction. There were a few well-known Imperial worlds that existed at the fringes of the area of threat, such as Cadia and Caliban, that are now remnants of what they once were due to the conflict in the area. The reason why I speculate that the Blood Gorgons were stationed near the Eye of Terror is because we know that when they became renegades, they fled into the Eye of Terror. When they emerged, they remained in the Bastion sector. While it is possible that they were stationed somewhere deeper into the more stable areas of the Imperium, this combined with the hint at their purpose being to fight chaos forces lends to the sector being close to the Eye. Looking at available maps of the Eye of Terror, there is no area of space labeled as the Bastion sector. Loyalist established locations as well as traitor locations have been indicated on the map, and none of them are the Bastion sector. However, being that the Blood Gorgons became a renegade chapter and their records were expunged from public Imperial archives, the location of the Bastion sector could have possibly been removed as well. removed, or hidden. There is an area around the Eye of Terror near the southwest border of its rim that is called on one map the Threnodite and on the other the Sentinel Worlds. On both references, this area of space is barred from access and requires inquisitorial clearance. When researching the Threnodite, I found no information regarding 40k universe, but there were references to other fandoms. But when I researched the Sentinel Worlds, I discovered that they were actually a class of Imperial worlds that were intended to serve as bulwarks of the Imperium's rule along the Great Rift, which is the tear of space that starts at the Eye of Terror. Sentinel worlds are said to have been a new designation of worlds when Rabute Guilliman was resurrected soon after the Great Rift actually happened at the end of the 41st millennium, and there are actually many Sentinel worlds along the Great Rift. However, these worlds called Sentinel worlds near the Eye of Terror have existed since before his return. The reason why I think this area of space is of particular interest in regards to the Blood Gorgons chapter is because they were said to reside in the Bastion sector. This area of space is designated the Sentinel Worlds. Sentinel Worlds are also called Bastion Worlds, and it's possible that these Bastion Worlds are actually the Bastion sector. Also, these worlds, this area of space is barred off from access and requires inquisitorial authorization to enter. One thing we know about the supposed cursed founding chapters is that many of them were hunted down or otherwise watched with a critical eye by the forces of the Inquisition. If this area of space is where the Bastion sector is, and this is where the Renegade Blood Gorgons chapter resides, and the Inquisition knows this, why hasn't the chapter been destroyed? For that, we have to look into their lore. From available information, the Blood Gorgons were assigned as the wardens of the Bastion sector. This sector is divided into a minimum of 6 known subsectors. A sector in 40k is the equivalent of a cube of space with walls that typically expand 200 light years away, and sectors are divided into subsectors centered around important systems. That being said, the Blood Gorgons appear to be the only Astartes chapter assigned over this vast area of space. With such a vast area of space under their responsibility, it's unknown if the chapter ever had a homeworld or if it was a fleet-based chapter. What is known is that the Blood Gorgons claimed 62 worlds throughout the Bastion sector, from which they recruited to add to their ranks. In my opinion, this leads me to think that they were a fleet-based chapter. However, the chapter recognizes one world, called Haut-Busik, as an ancestral world, as many Blood Gorgons can trace their human lineage back to the world. Little is known about Haut-Busik, except that its people are nomadic and that it is a plains world. Being that many in the chapter can trace their human lineage back to the world, but that the chapter recruits from 61 other worlds around the sector, this implies that while this might not be the chapter's home world, it is the world from which the chapter's initial recruits were taken from. What is known is that the Blood Gorgons would later be declared traitors to the Imperium, but it is not known specifically why. A characteristic of the chapter that is repeated in its lore is that the Blood Gorgons valued their freedom. This, combined with our knowledge that the chapter became renegades, implies that whatever the reason they achieved that status, it likely had to do with disobedience to the High Lords of Terra or rebellion against their direction, and being that they were so tied to the Bastion sector, it likely had to do with the chapter's protection of or sense of ownership over the sector. The Blood Gorgons would eventually develop the reputation of being known as pirates and thieves, implying that they stole resources from the Imperium while still loyal to it. Combining this to previous information, it's reasonable to say that the Blood Gorgons likely stole resources from other Imperial forces entering the Bastion sector out of a warped sense of ownership to it. This would appear to be the final straw for the High Lords of Terra, who would declare the chapter traitors only 6 decades after their creation and would send the Space Wolves chapter to deal with the Blood Gorgons. The Space Wolves have long had a history of being utilized by not only the Imperium in the 40th millennium, but the Emperor himself in the 30th millennium to deal with Imperial forces, especially other Space Marines that have strayed from protocol of loyalty. the Night of the Wolf against the World Eaters, the burning of Prospero against 1,000 Suns, the Emperor sending packs of Space Marine kill teams to, if need be, kill Primarchs who displayed disloyalty during the beginning of the heresy. The Space Wolves are the police force of the Imperium of Man, and it makes sense that they would be sent to deal with the Blood Gorgons. It is due to the Space Wolves hunting the Blood Gorgons that they were forced to flee into the Eye of Terror. Being unable to pursue them any further, the Space Wolves retreated from the area of space. Whether or not the chapter had been corrupted previous to achieving the damned status of traitor from the Imperium of Man, when the Blood Gorgons returned to real space, they returned as servants of Chaos Undivided, showing their defiance not only to the Imperium, which they had turned their back on, but even to the Dark Powers by refusing to be servants of any one Chaos God individually. When the chapter returned to real space, their armor color had stayed the same, and they also kept the same name and heraldry that they had when they were loyalists. However, their armor was corrupted by the influences of the warp, becoming spiked and baroque looking in certain areas, some areas of their armor developing gills as if they were living organisms themselves, and the chapter was distinctly known for their armor being covered in barnacle-like growth. The Blood Gorgons would make an immense Space Hulk their new fortress monastery. This Space Hulk would be called the Cauldron Born, and initially it would be divided amongst the captains or warlords of the chapter who operated semi-independently of one another. Though their chapter master Gamadin, was the face and leader of the chapter as far as the High Lords of Terror were concerned, the chapter's organization seemed to favor a more unanimous vote style of leadership between the captains or Khoitans of the Blood Gorgons. At their descent and emergence from the Eye of Terror, this style of organization was a detriment. Rival factions of Blood Gorgons would fight each other aboard the Space Hulk in open civil war. It was Gamadin who put a stop to the infighting by destroying those portions of the chapter that fed into the desire for internal conflict. Though entire portions of the Cauldron Born were destroyed in this Zone Mortalis style combat, the chapter was finally united as one, and Gamadin intended that no Blood Gorgon would ever raise weapons against one of their own kind again. The way Gamadin went about this was through the practice of blood bonding. The Blood Gorgons apparently relished freedom of thought as much as they did freedom of action. Before the chapter's traitor status, Gamadin had studied the warp, psychic powers, and even demonology, possibly due to their nature and responsibility to combat forces emerging from the Eye of Terror. In his studies, he discovered that it was possible to spiritually bond Astartes through the transfusion of blood and grafting of biological samples between two Astartes. It's unknown exactly when he discovered this method, but when he unified the remaining Blood Gorgons in the Cauldron Born, he made the practice a chapter-wide tradition. And the chapter's Churigan witches, which is what they called their apothecaries, would combine their knowledge of gene seed implantation with their knowledge of the sorcerous arts to tie the Astartes of the chapter through blood bonding. The benefits of blood bonding were that now Blood Gorgons would never fight each other without experiencing physical consequences, and they would be a more efficient fighting force. Blood-bonded Gorgons responded to each other in a way that other Astartes couldn't. These changes made it so that it was rare to ever see a single Blood Gorgon alone, and it also made them difficult to combat as each was operating with twice the amount of awareness. Blood bonding even influenced their squad sizes, with the standard squad size being composed of 6 Blood Gorgons, 3 pairs of blood-bonded Astartes, accompanied by slaves that serves as various types of chapter serfs. The downside to blood-bonded Astartes was that if harm came to one, it was felt by both. Gamadin himself experienced this when the marine that he was bonded to, Monomachus, was turned into a chaos spawn by the Dark Powers. On killing his blood brother, Gamadin himself experienced a tremendous amount of pain. The blood bonding process was a heretical practice steeped in demonology and utilizing the warp, but it also humanizes the Astartes of the Blood Gorgons, making them a renegade chapter that actually cares about each other. It instilled in them a level of self-awareness and self-control that was unlike many other chaos and renegade chapters that existed at the time. One of the first known conflicts that the chapter engaged in after emerging from the warp was the battle at Solobaston, during which the Blood Gorgons orchestrated an uprising amongst the world's tribal population against the ecclesiastical elements on the world, eventually claiming the planet as one of their recruiting worlds. The Blood Gorgons chapter still exists to this day, but they keep themselves in the Bastion sector of space. While they steal from any Imperial force that enters the sector, they also combat the forces of chaos within the sector in protection of the people there. The Blood Gorgons are a true Renegade Space Marine chapter, made in a sector of space, designated to protect it from invading Chaos forces, but refusing to be the lapdogs of the High Lords of Terra, utilizing Chaos as a weapon of empowerment, but still fighting against Chaos forces. The story of the Blood Gorgons is of a territorial Space Marine chapter that has turned its back on the Imperium, but is so tied to the area that they were created to defend that they don't serve as a threat to the greater Imperium. In this odd situation, they are allowed to continue existing so long as they stay in the Bastion sector. Now let's circle back and look at the available lore with that even more critical eye. The heraldry of the chapter is unknown, and the only official artwork that we have is of this artwork. Available information says that their heraldry is of a Gorgon of Terran mythology. Looking at this artwork, we see clues of how that symbol might have looked. On the knee pad of this Marine, we see the face of a monster, and on the banners in the background, a stylized red skull with what might be a crescent above and below it. Though incomplete, this might actually be part of the heraldry of the Blood Gorgons. Also interesting is the helmet of the Marine in the picture. Usually we see Chaos Space Marines with horns coming from their helmets as a form of Chaos corruption. And though the armor of this Marine is clearly corrupted by the influence of Chaos, the helmet style might not actually be a result of that. The crescent style helmet seems to be standard in the chapter, as if you look carefully, the Marine in the back to the left also has the same style of helmet. Unique helmet designs are often indicative of themes of the chapter. A correspondence to this large, elaborate style of helmet is the helmet design of the Thousand Sons Legion, whose Egyptianesque style helmet crests are an inverse of the Egyptian pharaoh's headdress. This connects to the kind of architecture found on their homeworld of Prospero and the cultural inspirations of Egypt that went into their lore. With the Blood Gorgon style of helmet, I think this is indicating a reference to inspirations found in a conglomeration of both Indian and Asian culture. Though it might seem that I'm reaching with that assumption, it's not the only element of the chapter that points to that. In regards to the helmets, the style of helmet that the chapter wears is actually worn to scare away Chaos forces. Blood bonding is only one tradition that the Blood Gorgons practice. Another is called the Sacrifices of War, which is a 3-part ritualistic ceremony that the blood bonded brothers of the chapter perform before going to war. In the first part of this ceremony, the brothers re-swear their oath of loyalty to each other, both cutting off a piece of flesh or otherwise cutting open their skin, allowing the blood and flesh to be mixed into a brass bowl and turned into an alcoholic solution, which is supposedly drunken by both brothers. In the second part, called the Sacrifice of Armament, the Blood Brothers strip naked and lower themselves into a cauldron of boiling water. The water is so hot that it boils the outermost layer of skin, which is then scrubbed vigorously with salts. Then the skin is lathered in a woad, a combination of animal fats, minerals, and biochemicals, to toughen and numb the skin. Following this, the armor is put onto the Marines, segment by segment, connecting it to their black carapace by the chapter slaves, while the slaves and the Astartes chant an incantation to wake up the armor's machine spirit. The last part of the Sacrifices of War ceremony is the Sacrifice of Smoke. In warp travel, things often went missing. It's a universal phenomena that happens when ships use the warp to travel to locations. Things unlocked or unbolted went missing. It's why it's customary for chapters to pray to the Emperor before entering the warp, or why certain Imperial forces erect gargoyle-like statues throughout their ships, because they believed these things would ward away the almost poltergeist activity. The Blood Gorgons had their own way of warding this occurrence. They would go throughout the halls of their starships, letting off firecrackers that filled the corridors with smoke. Then they would parade in their war helms during this part of the ceremony as well, which they believed had to be so terrifying that they would scare even their chaos allies in the warp, otherwise ill fortune would fall upon them. During this part of the ceremony, the Astartes of the chapter would also dance through sporadic gestures as well, as their slave retinues beat drums and cymbals while dancing and chanting as well. Some of you think this might sound silly, but imagine that you're standing at a four-way intersection of corridors on a Blood Gorgon ship during the sacrifice of smoke. Each hallway is filled with smoke because of the firecrackers. You hear deep drumming, the clash of cymbals, a mess of chanting coming from each direction, and the sound of power-armored stomping approaching you. With every firecracker that is let off, you see in the flashes the hulking forms of fully armored, chaos-corrupted space marines jumping and contorting their bodies in a dance of threatening, seeking gestures, all while moving toward you. I don't know about y'all, but that's actually terrifying, and that's the point. After the sacrifices of war ceremony is complete, the chapters meet in a dining hall deep within the Cauldron-born Space Hulk to dine together as well as to discuss the specificities of the battle that they will be entering. This tradition can be assumed to be sourced from the chapter's ancestral world of Halt Busik, and the practice also inspired the name that the chapter would give to their Space Hulk Fortress Monastery, the Cauldron-born being named after the sacrifice of armament. The few worlds that are named in the Bastion sector include Halt Busik, Belasia, Simeon, and Solo Baston. Something that they all have in common is that they were all plains worlds that are inhabited by tribal nomadic peoples. It's said that the chapter prefers recruits from Halt Busik because the plains world is harsh and borderline inhospitable, which has made the peoples there tough and durable. Belasia is not really described except to be the site of an attempted assassination on Gamedon by the chapter's apothecary. Simeon is described as the Legion Plains, and Solo Baston was described as being inhabited by indigenous tribal peoples whose lands were being seized by the ecclesiastic forces of the Imperium. There is a repeated theme of Plains world and tribal peoples connected to the Blood Gorgons, and this might be a reflection of the fact that the sector is so close to the Eye of Terror that these worlds may have only sporadically been reached by the Greater Imperium and therefore were not as civilized. Something that is mentioned is that the chapter has slaves to serve them. These slaves come from throughout the Bastion sector and serve the Blood Gorgons chapter as black turbans, as armor serfs, as helm bearers, and dancers. The role of armor serf is likely connected to the placing of armor onto the marines of the chapter, helm bearers likely serving to hold the war helms of the chapter, which as we described earlier, hold important ritual significance. Dancer slaves also serve ritual importance as well during the sacrifice of smoke. The only role that is mysterious is the role of black turbans, which may be the most basic form of slave to the chapter. Many of the named characters of the chapter are no longer living. For example, Monomachus was Chapter Master Gamedon's first bond brother, but he angered the Chaos Gods and was turned into a Chaos Spawn. Monomachus was replaced by Sapta the Older. Sapta the Older was loyal to Gamedon, but when there was an assassination attempt on Gamedon and the Chapter Master was thought to be dead, the leadership of the chapter was supposed to go to Sapta, but it was taken by an apothecary called Mur, the guy who attempted to kill Gamedon in the first place. Sapta found out about this treachery and fought Mur for the position of Corsad or Chapter Master of the chapter, but he was killed by Mur. Apparently, something that Sapta the Older was known for was his armor, which was in the Mark II design, and his mighty beard, which went all the way down his abdomen, was full of rings, and was well oiled. When Gamedon returned from the failed assassination attempt, he killed Mur and the Murites, or those of the chapter who followed Mur, and a tactical marine of the chapter by the name of Barsabas would become Gamedon's bond brother. Other characters included Hazareth the Cruel, who was the first captain of the Impassives, or Gamedon's bodyguard, and Hammurabi, who was the first captain of the Impassives following the death of Hazareth. The names of those characters in the chapter, like Hammurabi, Hazareth, Gamedon, The names of locations like Halbusik and Balasia, the practices that involve dances to scare away evil spirits and chanting, all of them have a subtle reference to Middle Eastern and Asian cultures generally. In regards to whether or not the Blood Gorgons are a chapter that was created as part of the Cursed founding, I don't see any evidence of it. They don't have any flaws that are sourced from their gene seed and not imbued by their interaction with chaos. Their gene seed didn't show any signs of instability either. According to my standards of what a chapter created during the Inculaba project should be, though Sapta the Older was said to be a large Astartes, the Blood Gorgons weren't larger than standard Astartes as a whole, and they don't have any flaws that connected to the humans used to make them. Some could argue that they were made from a chaos-corrupted population due to their proximity to the Eye of Terror, but there's no actual evidence that this may have warped them genetically in any way. In regards to who the Blood Gorgons could be successors of, there are a few possibilities. The chapter utilized sorcery in a way that reminds me of the Thousand Sons Legion, and even their apothecaries doubled as sorcerers for the chapter, so the Blood Gorgons could be successors of the Thousand Sons using remaining gene seed from Mars, and this could add poetic connection to them being pursued by the Space Wolves given the history that the Space Wolves have with the Thousand Sons. Their blood ritual practices could suggest that they are a Blood Angel successor, but nothing in their history suggests any of the flaws of the Blood Angels, not even the Black Rage which all Blood Angel successors have. However, because of the repeated theme of freedom, defiance, tribal peoples, plains worlds, and infighting, I am leaning toward the Blood Gorgons being possible successors of the White Scars. When the Emperor created the White Scars Legion, he did so by implanting the 5th Primarch's gene seed into peoples on Terra known for their isolationist tendencies and deadliness in combat. Initially, the Legion was referred to as the Star Hunters because they were sent out before any of the expeditionary fleets to discover systems and worlds that would be of interest to the growing Imperium. This meant that they would need to be self-reliant and resourceful, as they wouldn't be able to be resupplied by the Imperium for years on end. When the 5th Legion's Primarch Jagatai Khan was discovered, his legion, the Star Hunters, were spread all across the galaxy. Upon making their way to Mundus Planus, the feudal plains world that would later be known as Chagoris, the legion had different colors of armor, different heraldries, different identities as individual warbands. But the Khan would change all of that, saying that the legion would be one, his White Scars, and he would command each of them to take a blade to their own face, forming a jagged scar in whatever way they were moved to. This mass scarification bonded them as the White Scars Legion and as the Horde of Jagatai. During the Horus Heresy, some of the Legion split and followed Horus Lupercal. This invoked infighting amongst the Legion, and those who betrayed the Emperor were damned in the eyes of the chapter. The story of the Blood Gorgons, I think, matches a lot with the themes of the White Scars. In my Primarch video for Jagatai Khan, I said that I think that the aspect of humanity Jagatai embodied was freedom, and that is definitely a value of the Blood Gorgons. So, I conclude that the Blood Gorgons are successors of the White Scars. Furthermore, I conclude that the Blood Gorgons are not a cursed founding chapter, but rather a dark founding chapter who turned renegade, but who remain in the Bastion sector, even to this day. So, doing research for this chapter was interesting because I'm almost 100% sure that this chapter was a homebrew chapter of the author Henry Zhao, who is solely responsible for the writing that we have on the Blood Gorgons through the Bastion War series. Games Workshop occasionally allows its authors to create their own chapters and for those chapters to be made into canon. I don't share that information to somehow take away from the credibility of the Blood Gorgons because they are canon, but instead to celebrate it. Henry Zhao created one of the most interesting and iconic Renegade Space Marine chapters, predating even the Astral Claws. The Blood Gorgons were, for at least 2 editions of Warhammer 40k, the face of the Chaos faction, having been featured on the Chaos Space Marine codexes without most people even realizing what chapter was being featured on the cover. The Blood Gorgons are figureheads of Renegade Space Marines, and it's really fun to have speculated about them in this video. Another reason why I share that they were creations of Henry Zhao is because I had to assume and speculate a lot more than I usually have to because there is very little information about them. Though I explained why I think certain things about the Blood Gorgons lore, I can't say that I'm right about my assumptions. Only Henry Zhao would know this, and if by any stroke of luck Mr. Zhao watches this video and wishes to clarify any points about his lore, I would appreciate it and I would be very happy if he did. I think the Blood Gorgons would make a very interesting kill team idea, especially with the standard size of a squad being 6 Marines accompanied by chapter slaves. As an army, I think they would be cultist heavy. You would even be able to use and modify the Khorne Berserker helmets to represent the war helmets of the chapter. Well, that was our deep dive into the lore of the Blood Gorgons chapter. Let me know what you think about them in the comments below. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.